near his house. Shouts of children on their way to school, men going sleepy-eyed to their work in the town, women calling out to one another. Africa waking up and starting the day. People arose early, but it would be best to wait an hour or so before he telephoned Ramotswe, which would give her time to get up and make her morning cup of bush tea. Once she had done that, he knew that she liked to sit outside for half an hour or so and watch the birds on her patch of grass. There were hoopoes, with their black and white stripes, pecking at insects like little mechanical toys, and the strutting ring-neck doves, engaged in their constant wooing. Ramotswe liked birds, and perhaps, if she were interested, he could build her an aviary. They could breed doves, maybe, or even, as some people did, something bigger, such as buzzards, though what they would do with buzzards once they had bred them was not clear. They ate snakes, of course, and that would be useful, but a dog was just as good a means of keeping snakes out of the yard. When he was a boy out at Molepololi, Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni had owned a dog which had established itself as a legendary snake-catcher. It was a thin, brown animal, with one or two white patches and a broken tail. He had found it, abandoned and half-starved, at the edge of the village, and had taken it home to live with him at his grandmother's house. She'd been unwilling to waste food on an animal that had no apparent function, but he had won her round, and the dog had stayed. Within a few weeks it had proved its usefulness, killing 3 snakes in the yard, and 1 in a neighbour's melon patch. From then on, its reputation was assured, and if anybody was having trouble with snakes, they would ask Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni to bring his dog round to deal with the problem. The dog was preternaturally quick. Snakes, when they saw it coming, seemed to know that they were in mortal danger. The dog, hair bristling and eyes bright with excitement, would move towards the snake with a curious gait, as if it was standing on the tips of its claws. Then, when it was within a few feet of its quarry, it would utter a low growl, which the snake would sense as a vibration in the ground. Momentarily confused, the snake would usually begin to slide away, and it was at this point that the dog would launch itself forward and nip the snake neatly behind the head. This broke its back, and the struggle was over. Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni knew that such dogs never reached old age. If they survived to the age of 7 or 8, their reactions began to slow, and the odds shifted slowly in favor of the snake. Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni's dog eventually fell victim to a banded cobra, and died within minutes of the bite. There was no dog who could replace him. But now, well, this was just another possibility that opened up. They could buy a dog and choose its name together. Indeed, he would suggest that she choose both the dog and the name, as he was keen that Ramotswe should not feel that he was trying to take all the decisions. In fact, he would be happy to take as few decisions as possible. She was a very competent woman, and he had complete confidence in her ability to run their life together, as long as she didn't try to involve him in her detective business. That was simply not what he had in mind. She was the detective. He was the mechanic. That was how matters should remain. He telephoned shortly before 7. Ramotswe seemed pleased to hear from him, and asked him, as was polite in the Setswana language, whether he had slept well. "I slept very well," said Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni. "I dreamed all the night about that clever and beautiful woman who has agreed to marry me." He paused. If she was going to announce a change of mind, then this was the time she might be expected to do it. Ramotswe laughed. "I never remember what I dream," she said. "But if I did, then I am sure that I would remember dreaming about that first-class mechanic who is going to be my husband one day." Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni smiled with relief. She had not thought better of it, and they were still engaged. "Today we must go to the President Hotel for lunch," he said. "We shall have to celebrate this important matter." Ramotswe agreed. She would be ready at 12 o'clock, and afterwards, if it was convenient, perhaps he would allow her to visit his house to see what it was like. There would be 2 houses now, and they would have to choose one. Her house on Zebra Drive had many good qualities, but it was rather close to the centre of town, and there was a case for being farther away. His house, near the old airfield, had a larger yard and was undoubtedly quieter, but was not far from the prison, and was there not an overgrown graveyard nearby? That was a major factor. If she were alone in the house at night for any reason, it wouldn't do to be too close to a graveyard. Not that Ramotswe was superstitious. Her theology was conventional, and had little room for unquiet spirits and the like, and yet... In Ramotswe's view there was God, Modimo, who lived in the sky, more or less directly above Africa. God was extremely understanding, particularly of people like herself, but to break his rules, as so many people did with complete disregard, was to invite retribution. When they died, good people, such as Ramotswe's father, Obed Ramotswe, were undoubtedly welcomed by God. The fate of the others was unclear, but they were sent to some terrible place, perhaps a bit like Nigeria, she thought, and when they acknowledged their wrongdoing, they'd be forgiven. God had been kind to her, thought Ramotswe. He had given her a happy childhood, even if her mother had been taken from her when she was a baby. She had been looked after by her father and her kind cousin, and they had taught her what it was to give love. Love which she had in turn given, over those few precious days, to her tiny baby. When the child's battle for life had ended, she had briefly wondered why God had done this to her, but in time she had understood. Now, his kindness to her was manifest again, this time in the appearance of Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni, a good, kind man. God had sent her a husband. After their celebration lunch in the President Hotel, a lunch at which Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni ate 2 large steaks, and Ramotswe, who had a sweet tooth, dipped into rather more ice cream than she had originally intended, they drove off in Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni's pickup truck to inspect his house. "It is not a very tidy house," said Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni anxiously. "I try to keep it tidy, but that is a difficult thing for a man. There is a maid who comes in, but she makes it worse, I think. She is a very untidy woman." "We can keep the woman who works for me," said Ramotswe. "She is very good at everything, ironing, cleaning, polishing. She is one of the best people in Botswana for all these tasks. We can find some other work for your person." "And there are some rooms in this house that have got motor parts in them," added Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni hurriedly. "Sometimes I have not had enough room at the garage, and have had to store them in the house. Interesting engines that I might need someday." Ramotswe said nothing. She now knew why Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni had never invited her to the house before. His office at Tlokweng Road Speedy Motors was bad enough, with all that grease, and those calendars that the parts suppliers sent him. They were ridiculous calendars in her view, with all those far-too-thin ladies sitting on tires and leaning against cars. Those ladies were useless for everything. They wouldn't be good for having children, and not one of them looked as if she had her school certificate or even her Standard 6. They were useless good-time girls who only made men all hot and bothered, and that was no good to anybody. If only men knew what fools of them these bad girls made. But they didn't know it, and it was hopeless trying to point it out to them. They arrived at the entrance to his driveway, and Ramotswe sat in the car while Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni pushed open the silver-painted gate. She noted that the dustbin had been pushed open by dogs, and that scraps of paper and other rubbish were lying about. If she were to move here, that would soon be stopped. In traditional Botswana society, keeping the yard in good order was a woman's responsibility, and she would certainly not wish to be associated with a yard like this. They parked in front of the stoep, under a rough car shelter that Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni had fashioned out of shade netting. It was a large house by modern standards, built in a day when builders had no reason to worry about space. There was the whole of Africa in those days, most of it unused, and nobody bothered to save space. Now it was different, and people had begun to worry about cities and how they gobbled up the bush surrounding them. This house, a low, rather gloomy bungalow under a corrugated tin roof, had been built for a colonial official in Protectorate days. The outer walls were plastered and whitewashed, and the floors were polished red cement, laid out in large squares. Such floors always seemed cool on the feet in the hot months, although, for real comfort, it was hard to better the beaten mud or cattle dung of traditional floors. Ramotswe looked about her. They were in the living room, into which the front door gave immediate entrance. There was a heavy suite of furniture, expensive in its day, but now looking distinctly down at heel. The chairs, which had wide wooden arms, were upholstered in red, and there was a table of black hardwood on which an empty glass and an ashtray stood. On the walls there was a picture of a mountain, painted on dark velvet, a wooden kudu head, and a small picture of Nelson Mandela. The whole effect was perfectly pleasing, thought Ramotswe, although it certainly had that forlorn look so characteristic of an unmarried man's room. "This is a very fine room," observed Ramotswe. Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni beamed with pleasure. "I try to keep this room tidy," he said. "It is important to have a special room for important visitors." "Do you have any important visitors?" asked Ramotswe. Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni frowned. "There have been none so far," he said. "But it is always possible." "Yes," agreed Ramotswe. "One never knows." She looked over her shoulder towards a door that led into the rest of the house. "The other rooms are that way?" she asked politely. Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni nodded. "That is the not-so-tidy part of the house," he said. "Perhaps we should look at it some other time." Ramotswe shook her head, and Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni realized that there was no escape. This was part and parcel of marriage, he assumed. There could be no secrets. Everything had to be laid bare. "This way," he said tentatively, opening the door. "Really, I must get a better maid. She's not doing her job at all well." Ramotswe followed him down the corridor. The first door that they reached was half open, and she stopped at the doorway and peered in. The room, which had obviously once been a bedroom, had its floors covered with newspapers, laid out as if they were a carpet. In the middle of the floor sat an engine, its cylinders exposed, while around it on the floor there were littered the parts that had been taken from the engine. "That is a very special engine," said Mr. J.L.B. Matekoni, looking at her anxiously. "There is no other engine like it in Botswana.